Chapter 6, Supply, Demand, and Government Policy. The questions we seek answers to are what are price ceilings and price floors? What are some examples of each? How do price ceilings and price floors affect market outcomes? How do taxes affect market outcomes? How do the effects depend on whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers? What is the incidence of a tax? What determines the incidence of a tax? These are the government policies that alter the market outcome. Price controls, including price ceilings and price floors. Price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. Example of price ceilings, rent control laws. Price floor, legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold. Examples would be minimum wage laws. Taxes, government can make buyers or sellers pay a specific amount on each unit sold. Example one, let's look at government policy with respect to market for apartments. Let's take a demand and supply graph that is at equilibrium. The equilibrium rent is 800 and 300 apartments are being rented out. This is a market equilibrium without price control. The government does not intervene. Let's look at the effect of government intervention to set prices. How price ceiling affect market outcomes. Price ceiling set above equilibrium, like in this example, has no impact on the market. For a price ceiling to be effective, it must be set below equilibrium. So a price ceiling set at above equilibrium is non-binding and is not effective. The market will find its own equilibrium. For a price ceiling to be binding, it must be set below equilibrium. So if a price ceiling is set at 500, as you can see, demand will be 400, supply will be 250. There's a shortage in this market. So a binding price ceiling must be below equilibrium and must create a shortage. Price ceiling in a rental market tends to get worse. The shortage gets larger in the long run because, in the long run, as we studied back in chapter 5, supply and demand becomes more elastic. And so the shortage becomes larger. No, well, now we have shortages. What do we do with them? Okay, because of a shortage, sellers must ration the goods among the buyers. And since price system has broken down, there are some rationing mechanisms. There will be long waiting lists, and in the case of apartments, there will be discrimination according to sellers' biases. And these biases are often unfair and inefficient. And the goods do not necessarily go to those who value them most. That is the negative effect of government intervention in the rental market. In the market for labor, we are looking at an example of minimum wage. This is a market for unskilled labor. Only mainly unskilled labor and teenagers are affected by minimum wage laws. And we are using demand and supply to see the effect of government policy. If this market is at equilibrium at $6 and 500 people are hired, this is a market before government intervention. Let's look at the case where government moves in to set a minimum wage. So if the government sets a minimum wage at $5 when equilibrium wage is $6, that is a price floor that is set below equilibrium and it will be non-binding. A price floor below equilibrium price is non-binding, has no effect on the market outcome, and the market will ignore it. For a price floor to be binding, it must be set at above equilibrium. The equilibrium wage is $6, is below the floor, and is illegal. You're not allowed to charge $6 once the government establishes a minimum wage. And so it is going to be creating a surplus in the marketplace. As we can see here, suppliers will make available 550 people will be looking for a job. On the demand side, employers will only be looking to hire 400. So we're going to have surplus of labor here, which means a binding price floor must create unemployment in this case. Minimum wage laws do not affect highly skilled workers. They do not affect teen workers. A 10% increase in minimum wage raises teen employment by 1 to 3%. Minimum wage, asking the experts if the federal minimum wage is raised gradually from 15 to $15 per hour by 2020, the employment rate for low wage US workers will be substantially lower than it would be under the status quo. The result is kind of spread out, and 29% disagree with this, 37% are uncertain, and 34% agree. Let's look at active learning. The market for hotel room is in equilibrium, and we're going to determine the effect of number A, $90 price ceiling, number B, $90 price floor, number C, $120 price floor. First, the market is at equilibrium at 100. Hotel owners are charging 100, and 100 rooms are rented. When we establish a price ceiling of 90, remember that the price ceiling is binding if it is below equilibrium. And yes, this price ceiling of $90 will be binding because demand will be 120, supply will be 90, there will be a shortage of 30. The price falls to 90, binding price ceiling below equilibrium. Buyers demand 120, sellers supply 90, leaving a shortage in the marketplace. Number B, a price floor of 90. Clearly, you see that the price floor below equilibrium is not binding. Okay, so for a price floor to be binding, it must be set at above equilibrium. So this $90 will be ineffective, will be non-binding, and the market will ignore it. So equilibrium price is above the $90 price floor, so the price floor is not binding, and the market will go back to its equilibrium. Okay. The C says $120 price floor. Yes, that would be a binding price floor because it's set at above equilibrium. 120 units will be made available, and only 60 will be demanded. So there's going to be a shortage of 60. Okay. Evaluating price controls. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Economists usually oppose price ceilings and price floors. As we have seen, they have side effects that are negative. Prices are not the outcome of some haphazard process. Prices have the crucial job of balancing supply and demand, coordinating economic activity, and if government intervenes in the process and the price system breaks down, then inefficiency crops in the marketplace. However, government can sometimes improve market outcomes. Um, if the government wants to use price controls because of unfair market outcomes aimed at helping the poor, controls like price ceiling, price floors only hurt those they are trying to help. There are other ways that the government could use in helping those in need. For example, instead of rent controls, rent subsidies would be a better policy. Instead of minimum wage subsidies, or what we call earned income credit, would be a better policy. Taxes. Government uses taxes to raise revenue for public projects like roads and schools and national defense. Question is tax incidence. Who really pays the tax? Tax incidence is the manner in which the burden of a tax is shared among participants in a marketplace. The government can make the seller or the buyer pay the tax. Here is an example of a market for pizza. Here is a market that that is independent of the market, of the government. The government has not intervened here. Pizza is being sold at $10 and 500 is being sold. The market is in equilibrium. Now let us see what happens when the government imposes a tax on buyers. With the original equilibrium, the price buyers pay is now $1.50 higher than the market price P. The price would have to fall by $1.50 to make buyers willing to buy same quantity as before. For example, if P falls from $10 to $8.50, buyers are still willing to purchase 500 pizzas. However, we know that the demand will have to shift left. Okay. Hence, a tax on buyers shifts the demand curve down by the amount of tax, which shrinks the market, as we will see. Instead of selling 500 pizzas, only 450 will be sold. That is the effect of government policy. And sellers will receive 9.50 instead of $10. 50 cents being seller's contribution to tax. Buyers will pay $11 instead of $10. That dollar being a buyer's contribution to tax. Tax will be the area of this rectangle. Okay, the width is $1.50 and the length is 450. So the total tax bill for this particular example would be $1.50 times 450. Okay. The incidence of a tax, as we can see, the buyer will contribute to the tax, the seller will contribute to the tax. The buyer pays $1, the seller pays 50 cents, and the $1.50 will be shifted to the government. Okay. The government could also decide to impose tax on sellers. The tax on seller will have exactly the same effect on the market as a tax on buyer. The tax will be shared. The burden of the tax will fall on both the buyer and the seller. So here, the tax effectively raises the seller's cost by $1.50 per pizza. Seller will supply 500 pizzas only if price rises to $11.50 to compensate for the increase. And so the supply will shift to the left. Okay. The market will shrink to 450 instead of 500. So the new market equilibrium output will be 500. And as we will see, the buyer pays 11, the seller receives 950. And like before, the tax is shared between the buyer and the seller. Okay, exactly the same result. The area of this rectangle is the tax revenue that must be sent to the government. The smaller rectangle above is the portion of the tax paid by the buyer. The smaller rectangle at the bottom is the portion of the tax paid by the seller. Okay, the outcome is the same in both cases. The effect on price and quantity And the tax incidents are the same whether the tax is imposed on a buyer or on a seller. The fact is, the tax drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. Okay. Active learning two, the market for hotel rooms is in equilibrium as before at $100, and 100 hotel rooms are being rented. Suppose the government imposes a tax of $30 per room. Find the new Q or output, the new price paid by the buyers, the new price paid by the sellers, and the incidence of tax. So here, let us look at what happens. We move the equilibrium to the point where there is $30 difference here. So that looks like the buyer will pay 110 and the seller receives 80. The difference between the two is $30. That is the tax that is imposed. How is this tax apportioned? Um, the buyer pays $10 of the tax. The buyer was paying $100 before tax, now paying 110. So the buyer's contribution is $10. The seller was receiving $100 before the tax, and the seller is now receiving $80. So seller's contribution is $20. So $30 is the tax. The area of this rectangle is the total tax that must be sent to the government. And numerically, it is that $30, which is the width of this rectangle, multiplied by $80, 80, which is the length. So the total tax will be the tax 30 times the number of hotel rooms that are rented. Elasticity and tax incidence. Case number one, supply is more elastic than demand. When supply is more elastic than demand, who pays most of the tax? Let us see an example. We move the tax, that vertical distance is the tax, and as you can see, the seller will receive PS, the buyer will pay PB, and the tax is the area of this rectangle. As you can see, because demand side is inelastic, the portion of the tax paid by the buyer is larger. Look like the buyer has not much of a choice. So since the demand is inelastic, the larger share of the tax is borne by the buyer, and the seller contributes a little portion. Okay. So it is easier for sellers than buyers to leave the market. That is what it means when supply is elastic. Sellers have the freedom, they have other choices. But when demand is inelastic, which means consumers don't have much of a choice, that is why they will bear a heavier burden of the tax. Case number two, demand is more elastic than supply. If the scenario is reversed, where demand is now more elastic and supply is inelastic. Now it is consumers who have a choice. When demand is elastic, which means consumers have a choice, they can leave the market if you impose a tax on them. When supply is inelastic, it means sellers don't have much of a choice to make immediate changes. When tax is imposed, the fellow with the inelastic, the side of the market that is inelastic, will bear a larger share of the burden. In this case, the selling side. Okay. As you can see, the buyer pays PB and the portion of the tax borne by the buyer is smaller. This portion of the tax borne by the seller is larger. Why? Because the seller is facing inelastic demand. So the upper portion is the buyer's share of the tax, the lower portion is the seller's share of the tax. It is easier for buyers than sellers to leave the market. Sellers bear most of the burden of the tax. Who pays the luxury tax? In 1990, Congress adopted a new luxury tax on yachts, private planes, furs, jewelry, expensive cars. The goal to raise revenue from those who could most easily afford it, the rich. The luxury item, the problem is luxury items have elastic demand and supply is relatively inelastic. So, the reason why this policy backfired is, as you can see from this diagram, the supply is inelastic. As we have seen in the last example, when supply is more inelastic than demand, the selling side of the market, the supplier, will bear most of the tax. Let us see here. The seller receives PS and the buyer pays PB. And the portion of the tax borne by the buyer, who is in this case the rich people, is this smaller rectangle. The seller, who is maybe the employer, the guy who is hiring minimum wage folks to build these planes or make these yachts, is left holding a larger portion of the tax and may have to lay off people. So that policy backfired, and I think Congress repealed it soon thereafter. Okay, that was the side effect of a policy that didn't work very well. Okay, learning, active learning number 3. Prior to 2011, the Social Security payroll tax was 6.2% taken from workers. Workers' pay and 6.2% paid by employers for a total of 12.4%. The Tax Relief Act of 2010 reduced the workers' portion from 6.2 to 4.2 in 2011, but left the employer's portion at 6.2. Should this change have increased the typical worker's take home pay by exactly 2%, more than 2%, or less than 2%? Do any elasticities affect? Answer, explain. Follow up question: who gets the bigger share of this tax cut, workers or employers? How do elasticities determine the answer? Okay, here's the answer. As long as labor supply and labor demand have price elasticity of greater than 1, or rather, or greater than 0, anything positive, the tax cut will be shared by workers and employers. That is, workers' take home pay will rise by less than 2%. The answer does not, however, does not depend on whether labor demand is more or less elastic than labor supply. For the follow-up question, if labor demand is more elastic than labor supply, workers get more of the tax cut than employers. If labor demand is less elastic than labor supply, employers get the larger share of the tax cut. Summary: a price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price of a good. An example is rent control. If the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price, it is binding and causes a shortage. A price floor is a legal minimum on the price of a good. An example is the minimum wage. If the price floor is above the equilibrium price, it is binding and causes a surplus. The labor surplus caused by the minimum wage is the unemployment. A tax on a good places a wage between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive and causes the equilibrium quantity to fall, whether the tax is imposed on buyer or seller. The incidence of a tax is the division of the burden of the tax between buyers and sellers and does not depend on whether the tax is imposed on a buyer or a seller. The incidence of the tax depends on the price elasticities of supply and demand. We will end the lecture here.